Hello everyone.
About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Story 1. I had just finished a long day, my mind tired from the endless tasks that seemed to fill my every moment. The house was quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone aimlessly, trying to wind down before bed. As I swiped through the screen, a new notification popped up, catching my attention. It was a text message from an unknown number, but the message itself sent a jolt through my body. "You'll regret this." The words seemed to linger in the air, echoing in my mind. I felt a knot form in my stomach, the familiar sensation of anxiety creeping in. I stared at the message for a few moments, trying to process it. It didn't take long for the recognition to settle, and this wasn't just any random number. This was my ex. I hadn't heard from him in months, and yet here he was, reaching out in a way that sent a chill through me. I hadn't expected to hear from him, especially not after everything that had happened. We hadn't parted on good terms, and I had made it clear I wanted nothing to do with him. There were too many unresolved issues, too much hurt on both sides. So why now? Why this cryptic message? The words hung there, heavy and ominous, like a threat waiting to unfold. I debated whether or not to respond, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I considered my options. What was the point of engaging? There was nothing he could say that would change my mind, nothing that could undo the past. And yet, a part of me couldn't help but feel the pull of his words. What did he mean by "you'll regret this"? Was it just an empty threat, or was there something deeper behind it? I stood up, pacing the room as my thoughts began to spiral. What if this was just the beginning? What if he was trying to provoke me, to make me question my decision? I had moved on, or at least I thought I had. I had built a life without him, one that was peaceful, calm, and free of the chaos he had brought into my world. But now, with just a few simple words, he had disrupted all of that. I felt a strange mix of anger and fear, my emotions shifting rapidly as I tried to make sense of it. I looked at the message again, reading it over and over, trying to decipher the meaning behind it. There was something unsettling about the way it was phrased, like a warning or a promise. What did he think I would regret? Our relationship, the way we ended things, the fact that I had moved on without him. The questions swirled around in my mind, but the answers remained elusive, just out of reach. I tried to push the thoughts aside, but the more I thought about it, the more the unease grew. Why now? Why after all this time? It wasn't like him to reach out after everything that had happened between us. He had never been one to communicate unless it was on his terms, and this message felt like a departure from his usual behavior. It was almost as if he was trying to regain control, trying to reinsert himself into my life in some way, even if it was through fear. I sat back down, my phone still in my hand, the screen glowing in the dim light. I could feel my heart racing, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it was just a random message, nothing to worry about. But then again, maybe it wasn't. Maybe this was his way of making me doubt myself, making me question everything I had worked so hard to build. I glanced at the clock on the wall, the minutes ticking by as I sat there, lost in thought. The room felt smaller, more suffocating, as if the weight of his words had filled every corner. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that this wasn't just some random message. It felt personal, targeted, like he knew exactly how to make me feel unsettled, to make me question my choices. I decided to block the number, my thumb moving over the screen with a sense of finality. I wasn't going to let him control me, not again. I had made my decision, and no cryptic message was going to change that. But as I pressed the button to block the number, a sudden wave of doubt hit me. What if this wasn't over? What if he had more to say, more to threaten? I couldn't help but wonder if blocking him was the right thing to do, or if it would only escalate things further. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind still racing. I tried to calm myself, to find peace in the silence, but the message lingered in my thoughts. You'll regret this. What did it mean? And why couldn't I shake the feeling that it wasn't just a warning? There was something deeper, something darker behind those words that I couldn't quite grasp. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to focus on other things, to move past the message, but it followed me, haunting me in quiet moments. I kept expecting to hear from him again, but the silence remained. No more texts, no calls, no further communication. It was almost as if he had disappeared completely. But the fear didn't fade. In fact, it grew stronger, more insistent, as the days went by. Then one evening, as I was walking down the street, I saw him. It was brief, just a flash of movement from the corner of my eye. But there he was, standing in the shadows, watching me. My heart stopped, and I froze in place. The fear I had been carrying with me all this time came crashing down in that instant. He had been right. I had regretted it. I had regretted everything. But this time I wasn't going to run. This time I would face whatever he had planned. I had to. For my own peace. For my own future. Story 2. I was going through my phone, checking my messages and reminders for the day. As I scrolled through the Notes app, something caught my eye, a list titled Daily Routine. At first, I thought it was just something I had written to stay organized, but when I opened it, I felt a chill run through me. The list looked normal at first. Things like waking up at 7 a.m., having coffee by 7:30 a.m., and working on tasks by 9 a.m. But as I continued reading, I started noticing details I didn't recognize. The list included things I didn't remember ever scheduling, things that were so specific it made my stomach twist. There was a note to take a walk at 11 a.m., something I'd never done. Then it listed an appointment at 2 p.m. with a name I didn't recognize. I had no memory of making any appointment like that. I scrolled down further, and my heart began to race. There were items on the list that I had never done before, like pick up package at 4 p.m. and call mom at 5 p.m. I couldn't recall any of these tasks, but they were listed as if they were a normal part of my day. I closed the app quickly, feeling my palms sweat as I tried to calm myself. It had to be some sort of mistake. Maybe I had written the list in my sleep, or maybe someone had added it while I wasn't paying attention. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went back to the list, hoping to find something that would explain it, but the further I read, the more confused I became. There were specific times and events that seemed so familiar, yet I couldn't recall any of them. I had a dinner with a friend listed for 7 p.m., but I hadn't seen this friend in weeks. Even more unsettling, there was a note that said, "Look in the basement at 9 p.m. That one caught me off guard. I had no reason to go to the basement. I hadn't even thought about it in days. The idea of following this list felt wrong, like it wasn't my own. I stood up from the couch, feeling a wave of anxiety wash over me. I tried to push it aside, thinking that maybe it was a simple case of forgetfulness. I grabbed my phone again, but this time I noticed something else, a notification about the 2 p.m. appointment. It was from a calendar event that I didn't remember setting. The details were so specific, even down to the time and place. It mentioned a coffee shop that I had never visited. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I needed to find out what was going on. I called my best friend, hoping they might have some answers. But when the phone rang, I noticed something odd. The list on my phone wasn't the only thing that had changed. My friend didn't answer, but there was a voicemail waiting for me. I listened to it, hoping it was just a simple mistake, but the message sent chills through me. It was from a number I didn't recognize, and all it said was, "You've been following the list. Keep it up, and you'll be fine." I froze, my blood running cold. What did that mean? How did they know about the list? I checked the time, and it was already 2 p.m. The appointment was due to start soon, but there was no way I was going to go there, not with everything feeling so wrong. I decided to ignore the list, to leave everything behind. But the more I thought about it, the more impossible it felt to simply ignore it. As the hours passed, I felt a strange compulsion to follow the list. It was like something was pulling me toward it, pushing me to complete every task it had set out. I kept fighting it, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, but the voice in my head urged me to follow through. By the time 9 p.m. rolled around, I couldn't resist anymore. I went to the basement, the final task on the list. It felt strange, almost like I was doing something I shouldn't, but I had to. I opened the basement door, my breath shallow and uneven. The air was thick, the house eerily silent. I stepped down the stairs, my feet heavy on the wooden steps. When I reached the bottom, I turned on the light, but there was nothing there. Just an empty, cold room. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something on the floor, a piece of paper with the same handwriting from the list. My heart raced as I picked it up, and it felt like everything inside me stopped. The note simply read, "Well done. Now you can leave." I didn't understand. Leave? Leave where? I ran upstairs in a panic, my phone ringing once again. It was my best friend, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I locked all the doors and turned off every light. I needed to get out, to get away from everything. But the list was still in my mind, the last words echoing in my ears. I stood by the door, unsure of what to do next, as the fear started to consume me. Who had been behind this? Why was my life being controlled by a list I didn't make? All I could do was stand there, waiting for the next task to appear, knowing that whatever was happening wasn't something I could stop. Story 3. I had been exhausted from the long day and decided to get some rest. As usual, I placed my phone on the nightstand beside my bed, the soft glow of the screen still faintly illuminating the room. I lay there, drifting off to sleep, my mind foggy from the exhaustion, unaware of anything out of the ordinary. The last thing I remembered before falling asleep was the gentle hum of the air conditioner and the quiet stillness of the night. When I woke up the next morning, the sunlight filtering through the curtains was the first thing I noticed. I stretched, my body aching from the previous day's work, and reached over to grab my phone. But when my hand reached for the nightstand, it wasn't there. My heart skipped a beat as I looked around the room, but the phone was nowhere to be found. I quickly sat up in bed, panic creeping up my spine. My phone was gone. I checked the floor, the bed, even the bathroom, but it wasn't anywhere in sight. I began to get out of bed, more and more confused by the second. How could I have misplaced it? I was sure I left it right next to me when I went to sleep. I checked the nightstand again, as if maybe I had overlooked it, but it was still empty. As I made my way into the kitchen, hoping to find some clue about where it had gone, I froze. There, on the kitchen counter, was my phone. It was just lying there, as if it had been placed carefully on the counter. I didn't know what to think. How had it gotten there? I hadn't been out of my room all night, at least not that I could remember. My mind raced. Was I sleepwalking? But I didn't have a history of that. Had someone come into my house while I was asleep? The thought made my skin crawl. But there were no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest that anyone had been in the house. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the phone, my pulse quickening. I picked it up, checking the screen to see if there were any clues. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. All the apps were where they were supposed to be, and there were no new notifications. But the nagging feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right. I sat down at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of what had happened. I retraced my steps, thinking back to the night before. Had I been sleep deprived enough to just wander around in the middle of the night and forget about it? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had, but no answers. The day went on like any other, but the unease never left me. Every time I glanced at my phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something wasn't quite right. It was almost as if the phone itself was different somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint why. That night, I did my best to push the strange occurrence from my mind and went to bed again, making sure to leave my phone right where it had been the night before, on the nightstand beside me. I told myself I wouldn't let it bother me anymore. It was probably just a strange accident, something I'd forget about by morning. But when I woke up, the phone wasn't on the nightstand again. I shot out of bed, my heart racing, and immediately ran to the kitchen. There it was, lying on the counter just as it had the day before. This time, my pulse didn't just quicken, it surged. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain, and the thought of it terrified me. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the phone, and the only thing I could think of was that it wasn't just an accident anymore. It was intentional. Somehow, in some way, my phone was being moved when I wasn't looking. I checked the screen again, desperate for any clue, any sign that would make sense of it all. But nothing had changed. The apps, the messages, everything was exactly as it had been before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone or something was manipulating me. There was no way I could explain this away as a simple mistake or coincidence. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to convince myself I was just imagining things, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I couldn't keep pretending this was normal. The more I thought about it, the more the fear crept in. What if it wasn't me moving the phone? What if someone was doing it for me? But why? That night I took extra precautions. I set up a small camera in my bedroom, hoping to catch whatever was happening. I needed to know the truth, even if it terrified me. I went to sleep, my mind racing, my thoughts tangled in knots. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could think about was my phone mysteriously moving on its own. The next morning, I rushed to check the footage, praying it would offer an explanation. What I saw on the screen left me speechless. The camera showed me asleep in bed, just like every night before. But as the footage progressed, I saw my phone move on its own. It slid across the nightstand, slowly at first, then dropped to the floor and slid toward the door. And then, as if guided by an invisible hand, it made its way out of the room and down the hallway. I felt the world shift beneath me as I watched. There was no one else in the house. No explanation for how it could have happened. The phone hadn't just moved, it had been carried somewhere. And I had been completely unaware. I stared at the footage in disbelief, but deep down I knew that I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening, whatever was behind this, it wasn't just a simple mistake. It was something far worse, and it had already begun to escalate. Story 4. I was lying in bed, drifting in and out of sleep when I first heard it. The soft sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the house. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened closely, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It wasn't the house settling, it was too rhythmic, too steady. Someone was walking, and it was happening in the dead of night when I knew I was alone. I got out of bed quietly, not wanting to make a sound myself. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I tiptoed down the hallway, straining to hear any movement. The footsteps were faint but unmistakable, echoing through the empty house. My mind raced. Maybe it was the neighbor, or maybe I had left something on that was making a strange noise. But no, this sounded like someone was walking through my living room. My heart raced and my stomach twisted with unease. I crept down the stairs, my pulse quickening with each step I took. The house was eerily quiet now, but I could still hear it, the faint tapping of shoes on the hardwood floor. It was coming from the kitchen. I moved toward it, my breath shallow, the chill of the night air creeping down my spine. I reached the doorway and peered inside, my eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The kitchen was empty, nothing out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, convinced I was imagining things. But then, I heard it again, clearer this time, closer. It was coming from the hallway behind me. I turned around quickly, my body frozen in fear. But the hallway was empty. Nothing moved. No shadows lurking. It was as though the footsteps had never been there at all. I felt a wave of dizziness, unsure whether my mind was playing tricks on me or if something was truly wrong. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and dialed my friend, my hand trembling. "I think someone's in my house," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I heard footsteps, and there's no one here. I'm alone." My friend tried to reassure me, telling me to check the doors and windows to make sure everything was locked, but nothing seemed off. The doors were locked, the windows secure. There was no sign of anyone breaking in, and yet the footsteps continued to echo in my mind. I stayed on the line with my friend as I cautiously moved through the house, checking each room one by one. My breath caught every time I opened a door, expecting to find someone standing there, watching me. But every room was empty, just as I had left it. The silence was deafening, almost suffocating. I was beginning to wonder if I was losing my mind. Maybe I had heard something else. Maybe I was just tired. I sat back down in the living room, my phone still in my hand, and listened to the silence. The footsteps had stopped, but my mind wouldn't let go of the thought that someone had been in my house. What if I wasn't imagining it? What if someone had been there, hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. As I sat there, trying to calm myself, I noticed something on the coffee table, a piece of paper. I didn't remember it being there before. I picked it up, my hand shaking as I unfolded it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, messy, as if written in haste. "I'm here," it said, the words clear but unsettling. My heart skipped a beat as I read them again. "I'm here." The cold chill that had gripped me earlier intensified. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me, and I hadn't even known. I rushed to the door and checked it again, but it was locked, the deadbolt secure. There was no sign of forced entry. My mind spun in circles as I tried to make sense of it. How could someone leave a note without breaking in? How had they gotten in and out without me noticing? I was starting to panic, every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside, making me jump. I didn't know what to do. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening for any sounds, any signs that someone was still here. The footsteps never returned, but the silence felt oppressive. When morning came, I checked the house once more, but everything seemed normal. The note was still on the table, and the house felt like it always did, empty, silent, and cold. But the question lingered: who had been walking around in my house? How had they gotten in? And why had they left the note? No answers, only more questions. I locked the doors, checked every window, and stayed vigilant, but the sense of unease never fully left me. It's been days now, and every creak of the floor, every shadow in the corner of my eye, makes me wonder if someone is still watching, still waiting. I try to convince myself that it was just a bad dream, but deep down I know it wasn't. I can't shake the feeling that whatever or whoever was here is still here, waiting for the right moment. Story 5. I was getting ready for bed when I heard the faint sound of paper sliding across the floor. It was almost imperceptible, as if someone was carefully pushing something under my door. I stood frozen for a moment, listening, waiting for another sound. When I finally walked over and knelt down, I saw it a letter, plain and unmarked, tucked just inside the edge of the door. My heart skipped a beat as I reached for it, uncertainty creeping into my chest. I opened the letter slowly, my hands trembling. The paper felt cold and heavy in my fingers, and I could barely make myself read the few words written in stark, bold handwriting. It said, "I know where you are." I stood there, staring at the letter in disbelief, unable to comprehend what I was reading. The message was simple, but the weight of it sank in like a stone in my stomach. Someone knew where I lived. Someone had been watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and the air seemed to grow heavier around me. I looked around the room, feeling the walls close in on me. I checked the door again, making sure it was locked, then peered through the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside, watching me. But there was nothing. The night was quiet, too quiet, and the darkness outside seemed to press in like a suffocating blanket. I felt like a target, exposed, with no way to protect myself from whoever had sent this message. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here, close enough to slip this letter under my door without me noticing. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? That I had received a letter with a vague, ominous message. It sounded so ridiculous when I said it out loud, but then again the words were clear and deliberate. Whoever sent it wasn't just playing games, they were trying to scare me, and it was working. The more I thought about it, the more my mind raced. I tried to think of anyone who might have a reason to threaten me, but no one came to mind. My life had been normal, too normal, it seemed. Nothing out of the ordinary. But now, with this letter in my hands, everything felt wrong. I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I needed to get out, to go somewhere safe, even though I didn't know where that would be. I grabbed my phone and tried to call a friend, but the signal was weak. My fingers fumbled with the screen, and I felt a surge of frustration. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the feeling of being watched was becoming overwhelming. I ran my hand through my hair, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the paranoia. Whoever sent that letter had been here. They had to have been close enough to slip it under my door without making a sound. The thought made my skin crawl. I decided to leave anyway, grabbing my keys and heading for the door. But as soon as I reached the handle, I hesitated. What if someone was waiting for me outside? What if I walked right into a trap? I took a deep breath and opened the door slowly, my eyes scanning the area in front of me. The hallway was empty, as was the parking lot outside. No one. But the feeling of being hunted, of being tracked, didn't fade. It followed me like a shadow. I walked down the street, trying to keep my composure, but my mind was spinning. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long shadows that seemed to move with me. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see someone following me. The air was cold, the kind of cold that felt like it had seeped into your bones. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. I couldn't go back to that apartment with the message hanging over my head. I ended up at a nearby diner, hoping the crowds and noise would help drown out the growing sense of dread. I ordered a coffee, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it. My hands were shaking too much. I sat there, staring at the door, my mind racing, trying to figure out who could have done this. Who would send a message like that? And why me? The longer I sat there, the more it felt like the world had become a little more dangerous. Like someone was out there, waiting for me to slip up. I couldn't relax, couldn't settle. Every person who walked through the door seemed like a potential threat. Every car that passed by seemed like it might stop, and someone would step out with a plan to harm me. Hours passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, that I was being led somewhere, herded like a sheep to slaughter. I didn't feel like myself anymore. I felt like I was living in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I had no choice but to go back. It didn't matter how terrified I was. I couldn't keep running forever. When I got back to my apartment, everything was the same. The silence was deafening. The lights were dim, the door still locked. I walked in cautiously, the dread sitting heavy in my chest. I couldn't help but feel like someone was there, waiting for me, just out of sight. I checked the apartment one more time, every room, every corner. But nothing had changed. I was alone. The letter still sat on the table, taunting me with its cryptic message. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, my hands trembling. It was a message from an unknown number. I know where you are, and I'm closer than you think. I dropped the phone in shock, the words echoing in my mind. It was a warning. Whoever had been sending these messages was getting closer, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I had no answers, no way to escape. I was trapped, and there was no one who could help. The silence in the apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in on me, and I knew without a doubt that I wasn't safe anymore. Story 6. I opened the door to my apartment to find all the lights off, and everything was rearranged. The sudden darkness hit me like a wave, the air thick with an uneasy silence. I fumbled for the light switch, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I flipped it on, nothing happened. The power was out, but that wasn't what disturbed me the most. It was the way everything in the room had been moved, the way things had been shifted from their usual places. The couch, which had been against the far wall, was now in the middle of the living room. The coffee table was on its side, and my bookshelves were completely turned around, their contents scattered across the floor. My kitchen was the same, everything out of place. The dishes had been emptied from the cabinets and placed in the sink, neatly stacked, but there was no reason for it. No one had been in my apartment. I hadn't had any visitors. I stepped further into the room, my feet shuffling across the floor, the cold air pressing in around me. My stomach twisted with fear. Had I done this? Was it possible that I'd been sleepwalking or somehow rearranged my apartment in a daze? I tried to reason with myself, but deep down I knew it wasn't me. Something was wrong. I walked into the bedroom, my breath shallow, and froze in the doorway. The bed had been stripped of its sheets, the mattress pushed to one side. The dresser drawers were open, and my clothes had been pulled out, scattered across the floor. But it wasn't just the disarray that disturbed me, it was the feeling of someone else having been there. Someone who had been in my space, rifling through my things. My mind raced with possibilities, trying to figure out what had happened. Maybe I'd left the door unlocked. Maybe someone had broken in and made a mess. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. If someone had been there, they would have left a trace, wouldn't they? The door was still locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. It was as if the intruder had simply vanished into thin air. I checked every room, turning on my phone's flashlight to see in the dark. The apartment felt off, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. The silence was deafening, and the unsettling feeling that someone was still there, lurking just out of sight, grew stronger. I was never alone in this apartment, not anymore. Then, as I passed the hallway mirror, I caught something. A glimpse of movement just over my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart raced, my breath quickening. I looked into the mirror again, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing. Nothing but my reflection. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks, but the dread in my chest wouldn't go away. I stood there for a moment, staring into the mirror, trying to calm myself when I heard it. A soft noise coming from the kitchen. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, like someone tapping on the countertop. I froze, my entire body stiff with fear. I slowly moved toward the sound, the kitchen looming ahead. My footsteps felt too loud in the heavy silence, and every nerve in my body screamed for me to run. But I didn't. I couldn't. I had to know who or what had been in my apartment, why everything had been changed. When I reached the kitchen, the sound stopped. It was as if whatever had been making it was waiting for me. I turned on my phone's flashlight again and scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. The dishes in the sink were stacked neatly, the countertops spotless, like no one had touched them. Yet the feeling that someone was watching me lingered, suffocating and oppressive. I stepped closer to the table, and that's when I saw it. A small piece of paper, tucked underneath my coffee mug. I hadn't noticed it earlier, but now it was impossible to ignore. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. On the paper, written in neat handwriting, were the words, "I've been waiting for you." I dropped the paper in horror, the blood draining from my face. The message was simple, but it was the weight of it that crushed me. It wasn't just the words, it was the knowledge that someone had been in my space, had been watching me. They had been waiting for me to return to the apartment. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I backed away from the table. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of the apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late. Whatever had been here was still here, and it wasn't leaving. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, desperate for someone to talk to make sense of this. As the phone rang, I scanned the room one last time. The apartment felt colder now, like it had become something else, something unwelcoming. The walls seemed to close in around me. "Hello?" My friend's voice came through the phone, but it felt distant, like I was hearing it from far away. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. There was no need to explain. I could feel it now, the presence that had been waiting for me, the invisible weight that had followed me back. "I think I'm being watched," I whispered into the phone, my voice barely audible. But before I could say anything more, the phone went dead. The line went silent, and I stared at the screen in disbelief. The lights flickered once, then went out completely. The darkness around me deepened, and I knew without a doubt that I wasn't alone anymore. Whatever had been in my apartment wasn't leaving, and now it was waiting again. Story 7. I had just finished my day, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me as I sat on the couch. My phone buzzed, its sharp vibration pulling me from my tired thoughts. At first, I thought it might be a notification or something trivial, but when I checked the screen, my heart skipped a beat. The message was short, almost too simple, yet it sent a cold chill through my body. "I'm closer than you think." I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. Who could it be? The message was anonymous, and there was no number attached, just a blank space where the sender's name should be. I checked the time, hoping that maybe it was just a prank, a harmless joke. But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt too intentional, too unsettling. I stood up, my heart racing. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. The silence in the house felt heavy, almost oppressive. I walked over to the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside watching me. But there was nothing, no movement, no shadows, just the quiet of the night. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was nothing. It was just a random message, maybe even a wrong number. But the words kept echoing in my mind, "I'm closer than you think." The message was too specific to be random. It felt like a warning, like whoever sent it knew something. I looked around the room again, trying to find some comfort and familiarity. Everything seemed in its place, nothing out of the ordinary. But the message had already planted a seed of fear in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, someone who knew more than they should. I tried to focus on something else, anything to distract me from the growing unease. But the phone was still in my hand, the message still on the screen. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Whoever sent it was closer than I realized. I sat back down on the couch, trying to think logically. Could it be a mistake? Maybe someone was sending these messages to the wrong number. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a mistake. The message felt too personal, too deliberate. I needed to do something, but what? How could I find out who was behind this? I decided to check the security cameras around the house, hoping to find something, anything that could explain the feeling of being watched. As I pulled up the footage, I noticed something strange. The cameras outside were all blurry, the footage distorted, as if something had interfered with the signal. My pulse quickened. I rewound the footage, looking for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. For a split second, the footage cleared just long enough to catch a glimpse of someone standing near the side of the house. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. My stomach turned, and I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. The message wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had been close. I ran to the window again, heart pounding, but the outside was just as empty as it had been earlier. I couldn't see anyone. I felt trapped in a nightmare, my mind spinning with questions. Who was this person? How did they know where I was? Why hadn't they come inside? I grabbed my phone again, staring at the screen, hoping there would be another message, something that would explain it all. But there was nothing. No new texts, no calls, just silence. The kind of silence that was deafening. Hours passed, and the unease never left. Every creak of the house, every shift in the air felt like a warning. The message had triggered something inside me, something primal, a need to protect myself, to figure out who was out there. But the more I thought about it, the more the fear grew. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. "Look outside." I froze, staring at the words. I didn't want to look. I couldn't, but I knew I had no choice. Slowly, I turned toward the window, my breath catching in my throat. Every part of me screamed to ignore it, to turn away, but I couldn't. I pulled the curtain back, just enough to see outside. My eyes scanned the yard, the street, the shadows. And there, just at the edge of the driveway, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details, but I saw the shape clearly. It was standing still, staring directly at my house. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there as if waiting for me to notice. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Was this the same person who had been sending the messages? How had they gotten so close without me hearing a thing? The figure didn't move, but I didn't need to see more. I already knew. The message had been true. They were closer than I thought, and they were watching me. I didn't know what to do next, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my phone, called the police, and told them everything. They promised to send someone right away, but the wait felt like an eternity. I couldn't take my eyes off the window, unable to look away from the figure standing just outside. When the officers arrived, the figure was gone. There was no sign of anyone in the yard, no trace of movement. It was as if they had never been there at all. I never did find out who had been watching me or why they had sent those messages, but I never felt safe again. Story 8. I had just finished cleaning up after a long day, my mind still occupied with work and the usual mundane thoughts. The house was quiet, calm, just the way I liked it after the hustle of the day. I walked to the front door to check if I had left it unlocked, a habit I always made sure to follow. But as I reached the door, something caught my eye and mark, a strange, dark smudge right in the center of the wood. I stopped, staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The mark was unlike anything I had ever noticed before. It wasn't dirt or mud, not a typical stain. It looked more like a deep, irregular scratch, as if someone had clawed at the surface. But there were no signs of it being done with a tool, no jagged edges or any trace of force. It was smooth, almost as if the mark had appeared on its own, a part of the wood that hadn't been there earlier. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing against the cold, rough surface. There was no moisture or residue, nothing to indicate that it was fresh. It seemed almost as if the mark had been there for much longer than I thought, even though I couldn't recall seeing it before. My pulse quickened as I pulled my hand back, a sense of unease creeping up my spine. How had this mark appeared? I had no explanation for it. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing through possible explanations. Could it have been an accident, something I hadn't noticed when I moved in? But no, I had checked the door countless times before. I was certain it hadn't been there just this morning. The more I stared at it, the more it seemed to grow, to shift in a way that made my eyes play tricks on me. The mark didn't look stationary. It felt as though it was almost alive, pulsating with a strange energy that I couldn't understand. I quickly ran to the window, looking out onto the street, but there was no one in sight. It was a quiet evening, nothing unusual. No one had knocked on the door, no one had come by. I couldn't think of anyone who would have been near it. My stomach churned as I turned back to the door, considering the possibility that someone might have been messing with me. Pranks, vandalism, something to explain away the mark. But it didn't feel like a prank. It didn't feel like anything I had experienced before. There was something about the mark that made it seem intentional, as if it was meant to be there, as if it was trying to communicate something to me. I examined the edges of the mark closely, but it remained smooth and unbroken. I couldn't get a clear shape from it, just the unsettling impression that it was wrong, out of place. I pulled myself together, deciding that the best course of action was to lock up and forget about it. I stepped back, grabbing the key to secure the door, but before I could turn it, the mark seemed to change again. This time it wasn't just shifting in appearance. It was as if the door itself was reacting to my touch. The wood groaned slightly, a low, unnatural sound that made my skin crawl. I stepped back, heart racing, unsure whether I had imagined it or if it was real. I stood there for a moment, frozen, not knowing what to do. I wanted to call someone, ask for help, but the thought of explaining this to anyone made me feel foolish. No one would believe me. So I decided to do what any sensible person would do: ignore it, lock the door, and go inside. But just as I reached for the handle, I noticed something else, a faint, almost imperceptible scent in the air, like burning wood or something metallic. I turned back toward the door, the smell growing stronger, more pungent. I backed away again, but this time I felt it like a pressure building in the air around me. a weight that wasn't there before. It was as if something was trying to pull me back to the door, something invisible, yet very real. My feet moved against my will, as if I were being drawn back toward the mark, toward the door that had now become more than just a simple entryway. It felt wrong, so wrong. But I fought against it, shaking my head and trying to focus. I had to get away, to leave the house, to escape whatever this was. I turned around and started walking briskly toward the back door, the feeling of something following me intensifying with each step. But as I reached for the back door handle, I heard it, the faintest scratching sound, coming from the front door. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The sound of something dragging against the wood made my blood run cold. It was the same sound as before, the sound that had made my heart skip a beat when I first noticed the mark. But now it was louder, closer. It wasn't just a scratch, it was a deliberate, purposeful movement, as if something was trying to get through the door from the other side. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The scratching continued, growing louder, more frantic, as if the thing on the other side was desperate to escape. I thought I might faint, but I forced myself to turn and run. I flung open the back door and sprinted outside, the night air cold against my skin. But as I glanced back at the house, I saw it just for a split second, a figure standing behind the door, looking out at me through the glass. I didn't stop running. I didn't look back again until I reached the neighbor's house, my heart pounding in my chest. I knocked frantically, desperate for someone to help, but they weren't home. I turned back to my own house, my eyes darting between the shadows of the trees and the dim glow from the windows, half expecting to see the mark again, half expecting to see something or someone waiting for me. The next morning I returned to my house, bracing myself for whatever I might find. But when I checked the front door, the mark was gone. There was no trace of it, no sign that it had ever been there. The door looked exactly as it had before, ordinary and unremarkable. I reached out to touch it, hesitating for a moment, but when my fingers brushed against the wood, I felt nothing but the smooth, familiar surface. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the stress of the day had gotten to me. But deep down, I knew something had changed. I knew the mark had been real, and whatever it meant, it wasn't over. I wasn't sure what I had just experienced, but I was certain of one thing: it wasn't the last time I would see that mark, or whatever it had been. Story 9. I heard my voice echoing back at me from the other room, but I was alone. It wasn't just a faint sound either. It was clear, as if I had spoken just seconds ago. My heart raced, my pulse quickening in the quiet room. I stood frozen, not knowing what to do. The voice was mine, but there was something wrong about it, something off, like it didn't belong to me. I called out, just to be sure, my voice breaking the silence. Hello. My words hung in the air, and for a moment, I thought I might hear the echo again. But it didn't come. It should have been just a quiet house, yet the air felt thick, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting. My breath hitched in my chest, and I took a slow step toward the door that led to the other room. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to see what might be there, but the curiosity gnawed at me, tugging me forward. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling. When I opened the door, I was greeted with nothing but the dimly lit room ahead. It was empty, just like I expected. There was no one there, but the silence felt wrong. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, it felt heavy, like something was hidden, something watching. I took another step into the room, my eyes scanning the corners, the furniture, nothing unusual. But then, there it was again, my voice. Why are you standing there? The words came from behind me, clear as day, but my mouth hadn't moved. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the room was empty, as it had been before. The fear that had been building in me suddenly exploded. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Who's there?" I shouted into the empty room. The silence answered me, suffocating. I was alone. Or was I? I turned and fled back to the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty house. Every shadow seemed darker, every corner deeper. I could feel it now. That strange presence, the sensation that I was being watched. My phone, which I had forgotten about in my panic, buzzed in my pocket. I yanked it out, hoping it would be a distraction, something to make sense of what was happening. But when I checked the screen, there was nothing. No new messages. Nothing at all. I stood there, my mind racing, trying to understand what had just happened. My voice, my words, echoed back at me, yet no one was around. I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. Had I imagined it? Was I hearing things? No, I couldn't have imagined it. The voice had been too real, too clear. It was my own voice, but somehow not. Suddenly, I heard the sound again, faint at first, but growing clearer. "Why don't you come closer?" The words were identical to the ones I had just heard, but now they seemed to come from everywhere. I turned around quickly, but again, there was no one there. The air felt thick, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I bolted down the hallway, but my feet felt heavy, like I was moving through thick mud. The sound of my own voice calling to me grew louder, more persistent. "I'm waiting. Come find me." It wasn't just coming from the other room anymore. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, from all around me. Panic surged within me, and I ran faster, my heart pounding in my ears. I had to get out. I had to escape whatever this was. But the closer I got to the front door, the louder the voice became, until it was screaming in my ears. "You're already here. You've always been here." My hand reached for the door handle, but I froze, my blood running cold. The voice had come from behind me. "Don't leave yet," it whispered. I turned slowly, dread filling every part of me. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was a shadow, a dark figure that looked like me but wasn't. It had the same shape, the same height, but something was wrong. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its smile. It wasn't my smile. It was wide, unsettling, as if it were waiting for me to join it. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow but deliberate, and my body refused to move. I felt trapped, like a puppet on strings, unable to do anything but watch. The figure's smile widened, and in a voice that was unmistakably mine, it said, "I've been waiting for you to wake up." The words sent a chill through my entire being, and the world around me seemed to blur. My legs finally moved, carrying me toward the door, away from the figure. I was desperate, panicked, running, not looking back. But when I reached for the door handle, it didn't turn. My heart sank. The door was locked. "Let me out," I screamed, pounding on the door, but the sound of my own voice echoed back at me, mocking me. "I've been waiting." The figure's voice came from behind me, cold and relentless. I turned, but the figure was gone. Only the sound of my breathing and the echo of my voice filled the room. I could hear the voice again, this time quieter, fading into the walls. "You're never leaving. You've already woken up." Up. I slammed my fists against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The house, the room, it all felt suffocating, like I had been pulled into a nightmare I couldn't escape. I was trapped. My own voice surrounded me, echoed by the walls, the air, everything. And then, as I sank to the floor in defeat, The door slowly creaked open by itself. I didn't hesitate. I bolted from the house, the cold night air hitting me like a rush of reality. I didn't stop running until I reached the street. I turned back once, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, waiting for me. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty street. I didn't know if I had escaped or if I had simply walked further into the trap. I didn't know if I was still dreaming or if this was real. But as I looked around, I heard it again, my own voice softly calling from the darkness. I'm waiting. Story 10. N. I woke up to the soft hum of my radio playing, its usual static filling the room. The room was still dark, the early morning light barely peeking through the curtains. I had no memory of turning it on, but the sound was comforting, almost soothing. It was strange, though something felt different about the station. The voices on the radio weren't the usual morning show hosts, or the familiar music I had heard so many times before. This time it was a conversation, a quiet, intimate discussion that seemed too real. At first I thought it was a live recording, maybe an interview that was being replayed. But as I listened more closely, I realized the conversation sounded oddly familiar. The voices, they were mine, my voice and someone else's. It was a conversation I had no recollection of having, but it was unmistakably me. The words they spoke were clear, and they seemed to be discussing things I had long forgotten, things that felt so distant, like memories I had buried away. The more I listened, the more I felt a sense of unease. I had to get up and check the radio, make sure it wasn't some weird malfunction, but my feet felt heavy, as if the very act of moving was too much to bear. The conversation continued, the voices exchanging words like they were in the same room with me. The other person spoke gently, but the words they said sent chills down my spine. I know you've been thinking about it, the other voice said, soft but unmistakable. You just don't want to admit it. I sat up, my heart racing. The words didn't make sense. I hadn't been thinking about anything like that. What were they referring to? I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, that I was hearing things I shouldn't be hearing. But I couldn't turn off the radio. The voices were still talking, now more intense, as though they were aware I was listening. It felt as if they were directly speaking to me, even though they were coming from the past, from a time I didn't remember. I got up, moving toward the radio, my hands trembling as I reached for the dial. I tried to turn it off, but the volume wouldn't budge. The voices were getting louder now, the conversation more heated. I could hear the other person laughing softly, like they knew something I didn't. You'll remember soon enough, they said, and my stomach dropped. I didn't want to remember anything. I didn't want to know what this conversation was about. But there was something in the back of my mind that made it impossible to ignore. The words felt like a warning, like they were trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. The radio crackled again, and for a moment there was silence. Then, the voice returned, more urgent this time. You need to come back. It's been too long. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. What did that mean? Come back. Where? The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. And why did it feel like they were speaking directly to me, even though the conversation had taken place in the past? I quickly unplugged the radio, the silence settling over me like a heavy weight. But the words from the conversation still echoed in my mind, haunting me. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of unanswered questions. I hadn't been able to make sense of it, but one thing was clear: this wasn't some random broadcast. It was something that had been meant for me. A message from the past, a conversation I shouldn't have heard, but that was somehow meant to reach me now. I stood there in the dark, the radio still in my hands, unsure of what to do next. What had I just heard? And why did it feel like I was supposed to remember something? something I had forgotten long ago. Story 11. Antane. I had been sitting at my desk for hours, going through old files and organizing paperwork. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of the desk lamp, casting long shadows across the room. I had been meaning to clean out the drawer for a while, but never seemed to find the time. Today, though, I was determined to finally get it done. As I opened the drawer, my hand brushed against something unusual. It was a small, folded piece of paper tucked into the corner, almost as if it had been placed there on purpose. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling slightly as I unfolded it. The paper was yellowed, the edges worn, as if it had been there for a long time. I felt a strange sense of unease wash over me as I read the words written in thick, blocky letters, "We're coming for you." The message was simple, but the weight of it hit me like a punch to the stomach. My heart raced, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Who had written this, and why was it in my desk drawer? I stared at the paper for what felt like an eternity, my mind spinning with questions. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the words unsettling in their directness. There was no explanation, no context, just those chilling words. I looked around the room, half expecting someone to be standing in the doorway watching me, but the room was still, the silence deafening. I set the paper down on the desk, trying to make sense of it. I had no enemies, no reason to believe anyone would want to harm me. So why had this message appeared in my drawer, hidden away like some forgotten secret? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little sense it made. There were no threats, no signs of danger in my life at least, not that I knew of. Still, the feeling of dread lingered, gnawing at me. I grabbed my phone, thinking I might find some explanation, some clue. I checked my messages, my emails, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No strange calls, no ominous notes. I called a couple of friends, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched, but they were all busy. I hung up the phone and returned to my desk, my gaze falling back on the piece of paper. The words on it hadn't changed, but I couldn't shake the thought that they were meant for me. That whoever had written this knew exactly who I was, where I lived, and somehow had been watching me. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and began pacing around the room. Was I being paranoid? Was this just a prank? But as I thought about it, the more I realized it didn't feel like a prank. It felt like a warning. There. I felt trapped, like the walls of the room were closing in on me. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, but the more I focused on it, the clearer the message became. "We're coming for you." The words echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing second. Who were we, and why me? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed my phone again, this time looking for any signs that I wasn't alone in this. Maybe someone had left the paper there as a joke. But even as I searched, I knew deep down that this wasn't a joke. It wasn't funny, and it wasn't something that could be ignored. The message was real. It was personal, and it was meant to frighten me. I sat down again, my hands trembling as I tried to think. What was I supposed to do? Should I call the police? But what would I say? That I found a strange note in my desk drawer. How would that sound? Ridiculous, probably. I didn't have any real evidence that anything was wrong. But that note, those words kept circling in my mind. "We're coming for you." As the night wore on, the feeling of being watched didn't subside. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, made sure everything was secure. But no matter how many times I checked, the unease refused to leave. It clung to me, a constant presence in the back of my mind. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound outside made me jump. The hours dragged on, and I eventually went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. I lay there wide awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house around me. It was quiet, too quiet, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words written on that paper. "We're coming for you." The next day, I decided to go to work as usual, but something felt different. The air felt heavier, and the people around me seemed more distant. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I returned home that evening, I immediately checked the desk drawer again. The paper was gone. I froze. My heart raced as I looked around, my mind spinning. Who had taken it, and why? Had someone been in my house? I searched the room, looking for any sign of someone else's presence, but there was nothing out of place. Still, the dread gnawed at me. I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid or if something was truly happening. My hands were shaking as I went to check the locks once again. They were all secure, just as I had left them. Days passed, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, checking for signs that someone was following me, watching me, but nothing happened. The message had faded from my mind, replaced by the hum of daily life. Yet deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That whatever this was, it wasn't finished with me yet. And then one evening, as I was walking to my car after work, I noticed something. A small piece of paper was stuck to the windshield. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled it off and read the words written on it. "We're closer than you think." I froze, the blood draining from my face. They weren't done. Story 12. I was making dinner, the familiar hum of the kitchen surrounding me as I moved around, preparing the meal. As I reached for a utensil in the drawer, I noticed something odd. A set of keys sitting in the back corner, gleaming under the dim light of the kitchen. I froze. They weren't mine, at least, not to my knowledge. I had never seen them before, and they certainly didn't belong to anyone in my household. I picked them up, examining them closely. There were no labels, no markings to indicate what they might open. Just a simple set of 3 keys, all identical in shape, attached to a worn keychain with no distinguishing features. A strange sense of unease settled over me. I hadn't placed them there. No one else had access to my kitchen, so how did they end up in the drawer? I started to go through the possibilities. Maybe someone had accidentally left them there, or maybe I had forgotten about them. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had no memory of ever seeing these keys before. My heart began to race as I tried to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I walked through the house, checking every door and lock, trying to make sense of the keys in my hand. Each one seemed to match nothing I could think of. I tried them on the locks of the back door, the garage, and even the small storage shed in the yard. But none of them fit. My confusion deepened. What were these keys for? They seemed so familiar, yet so foreign at the same time. It was like they had a purpose, but that purpose was just out of my reach. The more I stared at them, the more I felt a pull towards something. I couldn't explain it, but something inside me urged me to figure out where these keys belonged. I kept thinking about the shed outside, wondering if I had missed something. Maybe there was something hidden in there, something I had forgotten about. But the keys didn't fit the shed door, nor any other doors I tried. I went back to the kitchen, feeling a growing sense of dread. I placed the keys back in the drawer, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in my chest. But I couldn't stop thinking about them. There was something about those keys, something unsettling. The way they felt in my hand, the way they seemed to belong to something I couldn't quite remember. I closed the drawer, but the thought of the keys lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those keys, their gleaming metal staring back at me. I kept wondering if I was missing something, something important. Why had they appeared in my kitchen? Was I supposed to find them? The thought consumed me, and no matter how much I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know what those keys opened. The next morning, I decided to try something different. I took the keys to the local locksmith, hoping they might have some answers. The locksmith looked at the keys with a curious expression, running them through his hands. "These are strange," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I've never seen keys like these before, but they look like they could be for an old building, something that hasn't been used in a long time." My heart skipped a beat. An old building. My mind raced. Was it possible these keys were connected to something from my past? I had no recollection of any old buildings, no memory of a place that would require these keys. The locksmith's words only added to the mystery. I went home that afternoon, the keys still heavy in my pocket. I couldn't let go of the feeling that I was being drawn to something I needed to find. I spent hours searching the house again, looking for any clues that might explain the keys, but I found nothing. There were no hidden compartments, no secret rooms. It was as if the keys were simply a riddle with no answer. As the days went by, I couldn't stop thinking about the keys. They were always with me, a constant reminder of the mystery I couldn't solve. I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The more I searched, the more frustrated I became. And then, one night, as I lay in bed, it hit me. A memory, long buried, surfaced in my mind. I remembered an old house I used to visit as a child, a place I hadn't thought about in years. It was abandoned now, the windows boarded up, but I had spent many afternoons playing near it, exploring the overgrown yard. I didn't know why, but in that moment everything clicked. Those keys had to be for that house. I couldn't explain why, but it made sense. The old house was the only place I had ever seen doors that seemed to require such keys. I had to go there. I had to find out if the keys really did open something in that house. I grabbed the keys and drove to the house. The journey felt surreal, like I was following some invisible force that had been guiding me all along. When I arrived, the house stood silent and foreboding, just as I remembered. The yard was overgrown, and the windows were dark and empty. I walked up to the front door, keys in hand, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried the first key. It didn't fit. I tried the second. No luck, but when I tried the third, the door creaked open, as if the house itself was waiting for me. I stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I moved further in. It felt like stepping into another time, a place I had forgotten but was now somehow drawn to. I explored the house, each room more unsettling than the last. But it wasn't until I reached the basement that I found what I was looking for. A small wooden chest, tucked away in the corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. I knew without a doubt that this was what the keys were for. I opened the chest, my hands trembling. Inside was a pile of old letters, papers, and photographs. I sifted through them, my breath catching as I recognized something, a picture of me, much younger, standing in front of the very house I was now standing in. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This house, this place was part of my past. I had forgotten about it, buried it deep in my memory. But the keys had led me back, to uncover something I had long since lost. As I stood there, holding the photograph, I understood some things are never truly forgotten. Story 13. And wait. I had just finished a long day of work and was sitting in my living room, trying to unwind. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. As I sat there, something caught my eye through the window. In the distance, just beyond the yard, there was a figure standing still in the shadows. It was hard to make out any details, but the shape of a person was unmistakable. I felt a chill run down my spine, my instincts telling me that something was wrong. I stared at the figure for what seemed like an eternity, my mind racing. Was it a neighbor? Someone passing by? But the figure wasn't moving, just standing there perfectly still. The longer I looked, the more unsettled I became. The shape seemed to be staring directly at me, though I couldn't make out any features in the dim light of the evening. My heart began to pound as the silence around me grew heavier. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone standing there, minding their own business. Maybe they were waiting for someone or just lost in thought. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't right. The figure remained frozen in place, making no attempt to move or leave. After a few moments of staring at it, my nerves got the best of me. I had to know who or what it was. I couldn't just sit there and let my mind spiral. I grabbed my jacket and rushed to the door, my hands shaking as I opened it. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air hitting my face. The yard stretched out in front of me, empty and silent. I squinted into the darkness, searching for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing. No one was there. The yard was completely empty, and the figure had vanished. Confusion gripped me. I had seen it, there was no doubt in my mind. But now there was nothing but the quiet rustling of the trees in the wind. I stepped further into the yard, my breath coming out in shallow gasps, scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, not even a footprint in the grass. It was as though the person had never been there at all. I backed up to the door, my nerves on edge. What was going on? Had I imagined it? But it didn't feel like a hallucination. It felt real, and the fear that had settled in my chest was too intense to dismiss. I closed the door behind me, locking it tightly, and stood there for a moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe the stress of the day had gotten to me, or maybe it was a trick of the light. I sat down again, attempting to relax, but the feeling of unease lingered, refusing to leave me. Every time I glanced at the window, I half expected to see the figure standing there again, staring at me from the shadows. But as the night wore on, the sense of dread didn't fade. It only grew stronger. I kept hearing strange noises, creaks, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The house felt colder, the air heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if the figure had somehow followed me inside, though I couldn't explain how or why. I stayed up late that night, my mind whirling with questions. What had I seen? Who was that person? Why had they been standing in my backyard watching me? And why had they disappeared the moment I opened the door? I had no answers, only more and more questions that seemed to circle around in my head. The next morning I woke up groggy, the events of the previous night still fresh in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to go outside and inspect the yard again, hoping to find some clue that would explain what had happened. But as I stepped out onto the porch, everything seemed normal. The grass was undisturbed, the ground wasn't wet, and there were no signs of anyone having been there. I looked around, but the yard was as quiet and empty as it had been the night before. It felt like I was chasing ghosts, trying to make sense of something that couldn't be explained. I spent the rest of the day on edge, constantly checking the backyard, half expecting to see the figure standing there again. But there was nothing, only the empty expanse of grass and trees. The days went by, and I tried to move on, telling myself that it had all been a figment of my imagination. But every now and then, when I looked out the window or stepped into the yard, the feeling of being watched would return. The sense of unease would settle in my chest, and I would find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to reappear. Weeks passed, and life returned to normal. but the memory of that night never truly left me. I couldn't forget the figure in the backyard, nor the strange sense of being observed. I began to wonder if I would ever really know what had happened that night, or if it was something I would never be able to explain. But one thing was certain: I would never look out into the backyard the same way again. Story 14. I was sitting at my desk late one evening, scrolling through my inbox, when something caught my eye. A strange email subject, something I didn't recognize. It had my name in it, and for some reason it made my stomach tighten with unease. I opened it cautiously, expecting some sort of spam or unwanted advertisement, but instead I found a document attached. The file name had my full name on it, and as I opened it, I realized it was a formal document, a contract of sorts. I stared at it for a moment, confused. The document looked official, filled with legal jargon, and in the signature line was my name, signed neatly as if I had agreed to whatever it was. But the strange thing was, I didn't remember signing anything. In fact, I couldn't recall even receiving a document like this, let alone agreeing to its terms. My heart began to race as I skimmed through the document. It detailed something about a service I supposedly had signed up for, with a hefty fee attached. I didn't recognize this service, nor had I ever heard of it before. But there it was, in black and white, my name, my signature, and a clear agreement. I immediately checked the sender's email address, hoping to find some explanation for this bizarre message. It looked like a legitimate address, one I hadn't seen before but appeared professional. It didn't look like spam, and the document itself seemed too polished to be a scam. My mind was reeling. Had I somehow signed up for this without remembering? Maybe I had clicked something by accident. But I was usually so careful about those things, so cautious about my online activity. I didn't recall agreeing to anything, especially not something like this. I sat back in my chair, trying to calm my racing thoughts. There had to be a mistake. Maybe it was a phishing attempt, but it felt too real. The more I stared at the document, the more unsettling it became. The contract outlined specific obligations on my part, things I knew I hadn't agreed to. It was as if someone had forged my signature, but it didn't look like a forgery. It looked too real. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone trying to mess with me? Had my personal information been compromised? I decided to take a step back and check if I had received any previous emails from this address. After scrolling through my inbox, I found nothing. No prior communication, no hints of this strange contract or the service it described. I thought about contacting the sender, but something stopped me. What if this was some kind of trap? What if they had expected me to react, to click something else, to open another link? I couldn't risk it. I tried to shake it off, but as the hours went by, the feeling of unease grew. I kept coming back to the document, rereading it, even though I didn't want to. It gnawed at me like something just beyond my reach, a puzzle I couldn't solve. I even checked my bank account to see if any unexpected charges had been made. There was nothing. No fees, no withdrawals, no sign of any transactions related to the document. But the contract remained in my inbox, a haunting reminder of something I couldn't explain. The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. How had they gotten my name? How had they known about me? I checked my social media accounts, my online profiles, looking for any signs that someone had found a way in, but everything seemed secure. I hadn't clicked on anything suspicious lately, and I had kept my personal information protected. Yet here it was, a document with my name on it, a signature I didn't recognize, and a service I couldn't recall. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Maybe I had signed something and just forgotten. But no, I was certain I hadn't. My memory was usually sharp. I remembered every contract I'd ever signed, every sign of any agreement. This was different. This was something that felt wrong from the start. It didn't make sense. The next morning, I called a friend and told them about the email, hoping for some clarity. They tried to reassure me, suggesting that it was probably a mistake or a simple error. But I wasn't convinced. Something about the document felt too intentional, too precise. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, tracking me, and they were trying to pull me into something I didn't want to be a part of. My friend suggested I report the email to my email provider or to some kind of online fraud prevention service, but I wasn't sure what to do. What if it was too late? What if they already had more than enough information on me? I decided to forward the email to my provider, asking for advice on how to proceed. But even as I hit send, I couldn't help but feel like I was in too deep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the signature, my name neatly written at the bottom of the document. I couldn't escape it. It was like someone had planned this out, carefully constructing a scenario where I would doubt my own memory, doubt my own actions. I tried to distract myself, tried to do something, anything, to take my mind off the email, but it lingered in my thoughts like a shadow. As the days passed, I didn't hear back from the provider. There were no follow-up emails, no updates. I kept waiting, hoping for an answer, but nothing came. My anxiety grew with every passing hour. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. Maybe I was being paranoid, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The document hadn't been a mistake. It was a warning, a reminder that someone or something was in control, and I was just a pawn in their game. I couldn't go back to sleep without thinking about it. Couldn't go through my day without wondering what else they knew. And then, as I sat there staring at the screen, a new email popped up in my inbox. It was from the same address. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it. The subject line was simple: "It's not over yet." My hands trembled as I clicked on the email, and this time there was no document, just those words. And then my heart sank beneath the text. There was a photo. It was a picture of me, taken in my own living room, sitting at my desk, staring at the screen. Someone had been watching me the entire time. Story 15. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, when a message popped up. The screen flashed brightly in the dim light of my living room, and I paused. The number was unfamiliar, and I couldn't recall giving my number to anyone recently. I opened the message, my heart already racing in anticipation. The words were simple but chilling: "You're being watched." The message was blunt, almost too casual for something so terrifying. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, my thoughts scrambling to make sense of it. Who would send this? I didn't recognize the number, and I certainly didn't know anyone who would say something like that. I quickly checked the time, late but not too late, and looked out the window. The street was quiet, the only movement the occasional car passing by. My heart thudded louder in my chest. It felt like the world around me had suddenly become too still, too quiet, as if something was lurking just beyond my line of sight. I immediately began scanning the apartment, checking corners and windows as if expecting someone to step out from the shadows. I didn't know what to do. The message was unsettling, but it wasn't exactly a threat. Still, the thought of being watched sent waves of panic through me. I walked over to the window, peering through the blinds, but nothing was out of the ordinary. No one was standing across the street. No one seemed to be paying attention to my apartment. I convinced myself it was probably a prank, some random text from someone trying to mess with me. Yet a voice in the back of my mind kept telling me that it wasn't. I returned to the couch and tried to ignore the message, but my mind kept racing. Who could be watching me? I didn't have enemies, at least none that I knew of. I didn't have any reason to think someone would be stalking me. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling the idea became. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following me for days, watching my every move without me knowing. The idea of being watched from the shadows made my skin crawl. I decided to respond, asking who it was, but I didn't get a reply. I waited for several minutes, but nothing came through. The silence only added to the unease settling in my chest. I felt like I was suffocating, as though the air around me had thickened. I grabbed my phone again, wanting to check the number, maybe search for it online. But when I tried, the screen flickered and froze. It was as if my phone didn't want me to see anything. That was when I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned quickly, eyes darting across the room. The feeling intensified, almost as if someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to stand and check the apartment again. I felt foolish, but I couldn't ignore the fear creeping up my spine. I checked the closet, peeked behind the curtains, and looked under the bed. Nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. The silence was deafening. The phone buzzed again, and my stomach lurched. Another message from the same unknown number. My fingers trembled as I opened it. "You think you're alone, but you're not. I've been watching you for days." My heart dropped. My eyes scanned the room once more, this time with more urgency. There was no sign of anyone, but the words from the message hung heavy in the air. It wasn't a prank anymore. This was real. Someone had been watching me for days. I tried to think of any possible explanation, any person who could be behind this, but no one came to mind. No one knew me well enough to say something like that. I grabbed my phone again and attempted to block the number, but before I could, the screen went black. It was as though someone was controlling my phone. Panic gripped me. The only sound in the apartment was my own shallow breathing, my pulse ringing in my ears. I tried to power it on again, but it wouldn't respond. I could hear my heartbeat echoing in the room, each thud more frantic than the last. I stumbled to the front door and checked the lock. I did the same with the windows, making sure everything was secure, but I knew that none of that mattered. Whoever was behind this message knew where I was, and they knew how to get to me. The idea that someone had been watching me, studying my routine, made me feel exposed in a way I had never experienced before. My thoughts were spiraling. Should I call the police? It felt too small to report just a message, a simple text. But I knew that feeling watched, feeling unsafe in your own home, was not something to ignore. I grabbed my phone again and tried to send a message to a close friend, asking if they could come over, but it wouldn't send. It was as if everything was being blocked, like someone was controlling the space around me. The next message arrived, this one even more direct. "I'm right outside your door." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My entire body went cold and the world seemed to stop. I didn't know what to do. I was alone, isolated, and terrified. The voice in my head screamed to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed by fear. I turned toward the door, my legs like lead as I moved. I had to know. I had to see. I peered through the peephole, my heart racing, expecting to see a face, a figure standing just on the other side. But there was nothing. No one. The hallway was empty. My hand gripped the door handle, shaking. I slowly opened it, but no one was there. The silence that greeted me was oppressive, suffocating. No footsteps, no sounds, just an eerie emptiness. I stepped back inside, my heart still pounding, still feeling the weight of the message hanging over me. Whoever had been watching me was close. I knew it. They were out there, somewhere, just waiting for me to make a move. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, like a cold presence lingering in every corner of the room, just out of sight. I couldn't escape it. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, the feeling stayed with me, creeping along the edges of my thoughts. And as I stood there, in the quiet of my apartment, I realized something terrifying. Being watched was only the beginning. Story 16. I woke up to find my bathroom mirror cracked, but I hadn't touched it. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow on the tiles, but something about the reflection caught my eye. The mirror, usually pristine, now had a jagged crack running across its surface. It wasn't the kind of crack that happens from a fall or impact, but more like it had been formed deliberately, splitting from the center outward. I hadn't noticed it the night before, and the thought of it being there when I went to bed made my skin crawl. I stood frozen in front of it, staring at the fractured glass. The break seemed almost too perfect, as though it had been planned, and it wasn't just the crack that bothered me. The reflection in the mirror looked off. It wasn't me. It was a momentary flash of something else, something unfamiliar standing where I stood. I blinked and stepped back, shaking my head, but when I looked again, it was just me. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the mirror had been compromised over time, and I hadn't noticed the growing crack. But the feeling lingered. My stomach churned as I thought about how I hadn't touched the mirror, hadn't even been near it. How could it crack like that overnight, perfectly splitting in a way that seemed almost intentional? I reached out cautiously, my fingers hovering near the crack. There was something unsettling about the way the glass caught the light. The edges of the crack seemed to shimmer, almost as if the mirror was alive, reacting to my touch. I pulled my hand back quickly, a sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. The bathroom, usually a peaceful space, suddenly felt heavy. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I could swear I heard a faint whisper, just beyond the reach of hearing. It was so soft that I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. But the whisper grew louder, more distinct, and it seemed to come from the direction of the mirror. I leaned forward again, my breath catching in my throat. "Turn around," the whisper said, almost too quietly to hear, but it was there. I quickly turned away, my heart racing. There was no one in the room with me, no one at all. The bathroom was empty, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I grabbed my phone and took a picture of the mirror, feeling a strange compulsion to document it. The crack didn't make sense, and I needed proof that I hadn't imagined it. But when I looked at the photo, the mirror seemed even worse in the picture. The crack appeared wider, deeper, and in the reflection, I saw a shadowy figure standing behind me. I stared at the image, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. There was no one behind me when I took the picture. No one. Panic set in as I zoomed in on the figure in the reflection. It was blurry, its features distorted, but I could make out a shape tall, thin, and vaguely human. My hands shook as I lowered the phone, looking back at the mirror. The figure was gone. It was just me again. But the crack in the mirror remained, and it seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Every time I looked at the mirror, I felt like something was calling to me from the other side, a presence that wasn't mine. I left the bathroom quickly, shutting the door behind me, but the unease didn't fade. It followed me into the kitchen, into the living room, into every corner of the apartment. Something had changed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror wasn't just a mirror anymore. I didn't go back into the bathroom for the rest of the day. I stayed in the living room, distracted by the growing sense of dread that seemed to hover in the air. But every time I looked at the bathroom door, I could almost hear that whisper again, urging me to look. That night, as I lay in bed, the darkness of the apartment pressing in on me, I heard it once more. A soft whisper, too faint to make out, but it was there, coming from the direction of the bathroom. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest, and stared at the door. The air was thick, heavier than it had been before. The feeling of being watched intensified. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something in that bathroom wasn't right, and I had to see it for myself. I got out of bed and walked toward the bathroom, my feet silent on the floor. As I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, but I forced myself to turn it. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, the cold air from the bathroom hitting me immediately. The mirror was still cracked, the jagged lines stretching across its surface. But this time there was something new. The figure from the reflection in the photo, it was there again. But this time it wasn't just a blur. It was clear. The figure was standing just behind me, its face distorted, its eyes hollow and dark. I didn't move. I couldn't move. The whisper came again, louder this time. You shouldn't have looked. In that moment, I knew the mirror wasn't just a reflection of what was in front of it. It was a doorway to something else, and whatever had been waiting on the other side had been waiting for me to look. Story 17. I had been cleaning out my drawer when I stumbled upon an old piece of jewelry I didn't remember buying. It was a small pendant, tarnished with age, yet somehow still holding a strange, polished sheen. I held it in my hand, turning it over and over, trying to remember if it had ever been mine. I couldn't recall ever seeing it before. It was a delicate piece, a silver necklace with a simple, round pendant. What stood out, though, was the engraving on the back. My initials JB were etched into the metal in elegant script. It wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It was personal. Yet I had no memory of purchasing it or even receiving it as a gift. I stared at the pendant, confusion and unease washing over me. How had it ended up in my drawer? I hadn't bought anything like this in years. There were no clues, no tags, no indication of where it had come from. It didn't feel like something I would forget buying. The longer I held it, the more questions started to form in my mind. Who would give me something like this without me remembering it? Why had they engraved my initials? And why did it feel so unsettling? I could almost feel the weight of the pendant growing heavier in my hand, as if it were carrying some kind of hidden meaning I couldn't understand. I thought back to the last few weeks, trying to recall if I had met anyone who could have given it to me. I thought about my family, my friends, my co-workers, but no one came to mind. There was no one in my life who would have bought me such a thing without any reason, without me knowing about it. Still, the pendant felt familiar in some strange way. I couldn't place it, but it was as if it had always been a part of me. I put it back in the drawer, but something told me I shouldn't. Something told me I needed to keep it with me. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept thinking about the pendant. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see it in my mind, the smooth, cool metal pressing against my skin. I tried to shake the thought away, but it lingered, persistent and heavy. The next day, I went back to the drawer to check on the pendant. To my surprise, it was gone. I frantically searched through the drawer, pulling out papers and old receipts, but there was no sign of it. My heart began to race. I could have sworn I had left it there, but now it was gone, as if it had vanished into thin air. I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe I had misplaced it. Maybe I had put it somewhere else without realizing it. But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. Something about this felt wrong. That night, I received another message. It was short, but it sent a cold wave of dread over me. You didn't keep it, did you? I stared at the screen, heart pounding. I hadn't mentioned the pendant to anyone. How could anyone know? My mind raced, trying to find any logical explanation, but none came. It felt like someone or something was toying with me. I didn't respond. I couldn't bring myself to, but the unease didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger, more suffocating. I kept thinking about the pendant, the way it had disappeared without a trace. Why did it matter so much? What was I missing? The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and confusion. I checked every corner of the house, every drawer, every shelf. I even went back to the store where I usually bought jewelry, hoping to find some explanation. But nothing made sense. Then, a week later, I found something that made my blood run cold. I was walking through the park when I saw it just lying there on the ground, half buried in the dirt. The pendant. I knelt down, my hands trembling, and picked it up. It was exactly the same, tarnished and old, with my initials engraved on the back. But there was something else. In the engraving beneath my initials was a date. The date was only a few weeks before I had found it in my drawer. The strange thing was, I had never seen that date before, yet it felt eerily familiar. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped in a puzzle I couldn't solve. Who had left it for me? How had it ended up in my drawer, only to disappear, and then reappear out in the park? It didn't make sense. I went home that night, holding the pendant tightly in my hand. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the messages, about the strange feeling that had followed me since I found it. Whoever was behind this knew things about me, things I didn't even remember. As I sat in my living room, the weight of the pendant heavy in my palm, I felt a presence in the room with me. I looked around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. The feeling was almost suffocating, as if something was just out of reach, watching me. I knew then that I was no longer alone. Someone or something was keeping track of me, pulling strings from the shadows, guiding me down a path I didn't want to follow. And the pendant, it was just the beginning. Story 18. I was jolted awake in the middle of the night by the sound of a knock. It was soft at first, like the tapping of fingers on wood, but it grew louder with each passing second, echoing through the stillness of my house. I glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up in bed, straining my ears to listen. There it was again, another knock, this time more insistent. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. My mind raced through possibilities, a prank, a neighbor in need, or maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. The knocking continued, each tap growing more urgent, more persistent. I slowly slid out of bed, my bare feet touching the cold floor. The house was quiet, too quiet, as though the world outside had gone to sleep entirely. I walked cautiously to the front door, each step echoing in the silence. As I reached the door, the knocking stopped abruptly. A chill ran down my spine and I stood frozen for a moment, listening intently. There was no sound now, no movement outside. I took a deep breath and opened the door, half expecting to find someone standing there, someone who would explain the strange knock. But when I swung the door open, I found nothing. The porch was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlight. The yard was still, with no sign of anyone nearby. I stepped outside, my pulse racing, scanning the surroundings. There were no footprints in the dew-covered grass, no shadows lurking in the corners of the yard. It was as if the world had gone completely still, waiting. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a trick of the wind, a tree branch tapping against the door in a peculiar way. But as I looked around, I saw no movement, no breeze stirring the air. Everything was completely still. My breath began to form small clouds in the cold night air, and a sense of unease settled over me. I glanced back at the door, my eyes briefly flicking to the shadows near the porch. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that something wasn't right. I closed the door and locked it, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I stood there, my back against the door, as if somehow that would protect me. I listened closely, waiting for another knock, another sign that something was wrong. But the silence returned, suffocating in its weight. I turned off all the lights and went back to bed, trying to dismiss the fear creeping into my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a strange coincidence, a product of a tired mind. But as I lay in bed, the darkness surrounding me, I couldn't shake the thought that the knock wasn't just a random occurrence. It felt purposeful, like it was meant to grab my attention. I stared at the ceiling, listening for any sound, any movement. The room was unnervingly quiet. It was then that I heard it, the faintest scrape, a sound so soft I almost thought I had imagined it. But it came again, this time louder, like something scraping against wood. I sat up quickly, my heart racing. The sound was coming from the door, as if something was trying to get in. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The knocking had stopped, but now there was this scraping, a slow, deliberate sound that made my skin crawl. I slid out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and tiptoed to the door. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking as I touched it. The moment I touched the door, the scraping stopped. I held my breath, my hand still on the cold handle, waiting for the next sound. But there was nothing. The house was completely still. I turned the handle slowly, cautiously, and opened the door just a crack. The porch was empty, the same as before. I stepped outside again, this time more cautiously scanning the area. The yard was just as empty as it had been earlier, with no one in sight. I closed the door again, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who would knock at my door in the middle of the night and then disappear without a trace? And why had the knocking stopped when I opened the door? It didn't make sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was still watching me. I locked the door again, double-checking the deadbolt, and made my way back to my bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every shift in the air, kept me on edge. I lay there, wide awake, staring into the darkness, waiting for another knock, for another sign that something wasn't right. The night stretched on endlessly, each minute dragging by. I kept my eyes on the door, half expecting it to open on its own, half expecting the knock to come again. As the hours passed, I finally drifted into a restless sleep, the fear still gnawing at me. The next morning, I woke up to find everything quiet, just like it should have been. The door was still locked, the house still standing, and there was no sign of anything unusual. But something had changed. I couldn't explain it, but I knew deep down that something had happened that night. The knock, the strange scraping, the feeling of being watched, it all lingered in the back of my mind. Days went by, and I tried to convince myself it had just been a bad dream, a product of stress or exhaustion. But every time I walked past that door, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something, that it was waiting for me to open it again. The knocking had stopped, but the unease never left, and I couldn't help but wonder if it would come back, or if whatever had knocked that night was still out there, just beyond the door, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Story 19. I found a note that said, I'm still here, just waiting. The words were scrawled hastily on a crumpled piece of paper, and there was no indication of who had left it, or how long it had been there. I felt a chill run down my spine as I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. It didn't make sense. I was alone in my apartment, hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard a sound. But here was this note, addressed to me or perhaps to someone else, though it felt personal, as if it were meant for me alone. I glanced around, the room now feeling unnervingly quiet. My mind raced, trying to piece together how the note had appeared. Had I missed something? Maybe I had forgotten something, someone coming over. But no, I hadn't. There were no signs of anyone having been here. My stomach twisted as I read the words again. I'm still here, just waiting. The phrase echoed in my mind, looping over and over. I went over to the window, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The street below was as calm as ever. No one was there. The silence felt even more oppressive, like it was pressing in from all sides. I turned back to the note, but it seemed to have changed in my hands. The words were no longer clear. They were blurry, smudged as if the ink had been soaked in water. It almost looked like it was melting in my grasp. I quickly dropped it on the floor, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. My heart pounded in my chest, the sensation of being watched creeping in like a shadow. I backed away from the note, my eyes darting from corner to corner of the room. The stillness was suffocating, the silence deafening. I felt like I was no longer alone. I couldn't explain why, but it was as if something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I had to get out of the apartment. I needed to leave before whatever this was took shape, before it found a way to get to me. I hurried to grab my things, my hands moving mechanically, my mind focused only on getting out. But then I heard it. A soft sound like a whisper, barely audible over the rush of blood in my ears. I'm still here. I froze. The voice was so faint, I wasn't sure if I had heard it or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But it didn't stop. I'm still here, it repeated, the words growing clearer, closer, as if the speaker was just on the other side of the door. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the door, waiting, listening. I couldn't move. I couldn't even bring myself to reach for the handle. The sound was coming from everywhere now, from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling. It surrounded me, filled the room, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I backed away from the door, my legs shaking beneath me. Just waiting, the voice whispered again, soft but unmistakable. I stumbled to the corner of the room, curling into myself, trying to make myself as small as possible. The note on the floor was still there, but it felt like it no longer mattered. The words had been a warning, a taunt, something far darker than I had initially realized. I'm still here, the voice said, louder this time, as though it was finally stepping out of the shadows. The room seemed to close in on me, the air thick and suffocating. My heart raced in my chest, my mind unable to make sense of what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Or was there something truly there, something I couldn't see, something that had been waiting for me? The door creaked open and I screamed, but no sound came out. I couldn't even find my voice. I stood frozen in place, paralyzed by fear, as the darkness in the doorway began to shift. It was then that I realized I had never truly been alone. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. It was a shape, an indistinct form that seemed to flicker, as though it was made of smoke. Its presence was suffocating, like it was consuming the very air around it. And then it spoke, its voice cold and familiar. I'm still here, it said, its voice laced with something dark, something that made my skin crawl. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to escape, but my body wouldn't move. I was trapped in this room, trapped with whatever this thing was, whatever had been waiting for me all this time. My mind spun, desperately trying to make sense of it, but there was nothing logical, nothing rational that could explain what was happening. The figure took a step closer, and with each movement, the air seemed to grow colder, denser. "You've always known I was here," it whispered. "You just didn't want to believe it." I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, trying to wake up from this nightmare. But when I opened them again, the figure was standing right in front of me. Its face was a blur, a shifting, formless mass that seemed to reflect my own fear. "I'm still here," it repeated, this time closer, its breath cold against my skin. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was empty once more, the silence overwhelming. I was left standing there, my heart still pounding in my chest, unable to understand what had just happened. I didn't know how long I stood there, the notes still lying on the floor, the words still burned into my mind. I'm still here, just waiting. Was it over? Or had I only just begun to understand the truth? Story 20. It started a few days after I moved in. The quiet calm of the apartment was shattered at exactly 3 a.m. every night. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, the creaks and groans of an old structure. But the noise persisted, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was knocking on the wall between my apartment and the one next door. It was a steady knock, not frantic, but persistent, a quiet tapping that echoed in the stillness of the night. I tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to some odd quirk of the building. Maybe it was the plumbing or the heating system. But after a few nights, I couldn't deny that the noise wasn't random. It was too consistent, too on schedule. Every night at exactly 3 a.m. the knocking would begin. I would lie in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop. It didn't seem to bother anyone else, at least. Not that I could tell. But it was enough to keep me awake, wondering who was behind it. One night, after a particularly long stretch of sleeplessness, I decided to confront it. I got up from bed and walked over to the wall, pressing my ear against it, hoping to get a better sense of where the sound was coming from. The knocking continued, just as it had every night, but now it sounded closer, more intentional. I could feel my pulse quicken, my heart racing as the rhythm of the knock seemed to grow louder. I knocked back once, just to see if there was any response. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating, and then, almost immediately, the knocking resumed, as though the person on the other side had been waiting for me to make a move. But something was off. The timing was too precise. The knocks weren't just coincidental, they were purposeful. I tried to call the building manager the next morning, but when I explained the situation, they seemed confused. "No one lives next door," they said. "That apartment's been empty for months." My stomach sank. I didn't know what to make of it. The knocking had been coming from that apartment, the one right next to mine. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I tried to process what I was being told. How could that be? I had heard the knocks clearly, unmistakably coming from the wall. There was no way I could have imagined it. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, trying to convince myself that I had been mistaken. But when the sun finally set, and the clock ticked closer to 3 a.m., I knew it was only a matter of time before the knocking would start again. I braced myself, my pulse already quickening in anticipation. As the clock struck 3, the noise began, just as it had every night before. This time, I wasn't going to just sit there and listen. I grabbed my phone, trying to decide whether to record the sound or simply confront whatever was happening. But as I stood there, hesitating, the knocking stopped. Dead silence. For a moment I thought maybe it was over. Maybe it had been some kind of mistake. But then, something even more chilling happened. The wall started to shake. It wasn't violent, but it was enough to make the plaster creak and groan, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. I backed away, my heart racing as the room seemed to close in around me. I couldn't understand what was happening. Why was the wall moving? Who was on the other side? Suddenly, the door to the empty apartment next door slammed open, as if something or someone had just barged in. I stood frozen, staring at the dark hallway, wondering if I had imagined it. But when I turned to the wall again, the knocking started up once more, louder than ever. I bolted out of my apartment, not caring about anything except getting away from the noise. I pounded on the building manager's door, desperate to find someone who could explain this. But when they opened the door, they looked at me with confusion. "What's wrong?" they asked. "The apartment next door, there's something in there. Someone's knocking on my wall every night." The manager frowned. "There's no one in that apartment," they said slowly. "It's been vacant for months. No one's lived there for a while." I could feel the blood drain from my face. But I've heard it. Every night, someone is knocking on the wall. It's like they're trying to get my attention. The manager just stared at me like they didn't understand what I was saying. I could tell they were trying to figure out if I was losing my mind, but they couldn't deny what I had heard. After a few moments of silence, they finally said, "I'll look into it." But they never came back with an answer. The knocking didn't stop. In fact, it grew worse over time. And every night, at exactly 3 a.m., the noise would begin again. A relentless rhythm that felt more like a warning than anything else. No one ever told me what was really happening in that apartment, and I eventually moved out, unable to live with the constant, unanswered question. But to this day, I can still hear the knocking in my mind, echoing through the empty spaces of my memory. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if the apartment next door was truly empty after all. Story 21. I had just moved into my new apartment a few days ago, excited to start fresh in a new place. The apartment was perfect quiet, spacious, and located in a peaceful neighborhood. I had spent hours unpacking, setting up furniture, and making it feel like home. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, finally escaping the stress of my old place. But something about the apartment felt slightly off, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Perhaps it was the unfamiliarity of it all, or the newness of the surroundings, but I kept feeling like I wasn't quite alone in this space. One evening, while tidying up the kitchen, I noticed something strange. The smoke detector in the hallway seemed a little different from the others. It was the same model, but the way it was positioned on the ceiling made me curious. It didn't seem to line up quite right with the others. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just an odd installation, but as I continued to clean, the thought nagged at me. I decided to take a closer look. I grabbed a chair to stand on and carefully examined the smoke detector. My heart sank as I realized the small, subtle markings around the edges of the device were not just wear and tear. It was too perfectly placed, and the lines seemed to form an intentional pattern. My hands shook as I unscrewed the smoke detector from the ceiling. The moment I did, my breath caught in my throat. Inside the small, hidden compartment, I found a tiny camera. It was so well disguised that I hadn't noticed it before. It was almost like a miniaturized version of the smoke detector's inner components, with a lens peering through a small, circular hole. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. How long had it been there? Who had put it there? And most importantly, why? I felt a wave of nausea hit me as the implications of the situation settled in. I wasn't just living in a new apartment. I was being watched. Someone had been monitoring me without my knowledge. I couldn't fathom why or who would do such a thing, but the reality of the situation was undeniable. There was no way to explain it away as a mistake or an oversight. Someone had planted this camera deliberately. I quickly unscrewed the camera from its hidden spot, my hands trembling as I held it.